Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about how white supremacists attempted to make the political process more exclusive and unwelcoming for Black people by limiting their voting and civil rights. This is a follow-up on the previous video where we talked about the Reconstruction era amendments increasing a sense of belonging for African Americans by abolishing slavery, expanding citizenship, and removing race as a barrier from voting. These are pretty good, but they are just words written in the Constitution. The thing that matters the most is if we are actually following through with them and not devaluing them. After all, just because these amendments were included in the Constitution, it did not mean white supremacists would automatically change their perceptions about Black people. They would still find ways to limit Black people's voting rights through political and violent ways. Let's talk more about this. To establish some more context, voting rights expanded since the founding period, at least for men, because women would not get voting rights until the early 1900s. Property qualifications had been eliminated in every state, and voting, at least in theory, was the right of every male citizen, except criminals and the legally insane. And so voting and citizenship had become linked. With the expansion of voting rights, the nature of democracy changed. No longer could the rich and powerful control the nation's destiny simply by excluding everyone else from the decision-making process. Of course, the rich and powerful could still exert control, but they were often forced to find ways to appeal to the common folks to do it. They would focus on having qualified people run a good democracy, which meant protecting the right people and the right institutions. As long as you stay in power, you can define qualified any way you like. There were groups, however, that saw those institutions as inherently unfair. Newly enfranchised African Americans, poor white or poor farmers, most of them debitors and workers who were in the forefront of the union movement were determined to increase their power at the expense of the traditional elites. They would have a much better chance if they were joined by the newly arrived immigrants hoping to fulfill the American dreams. More on this subject in future videos. Much of the effort to deny voting rights was aimed at African Americans. A white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, threatened, quote, "We come to warn you. Don't expect to see none of y'all at the election tomorrow. Could be dangerous. Never know what could happen. Might be set on fire. Even killed. The house could be burned. Who knows what would become of your women," unquote. African Americans in the South were the easiest targets since whites across the economic spectrum were appalled at the notion of sharing a government with what they saw as an inferior race. At first, terror was the means to deny the vote to Black men, but Black voters were willing to risk their lives and property in order to vote, so terror was eventually replaced by fraud. Ballot boxes were stuffed with white votes, while votes from Black men were destroyed. There were also women who were simply denied the vote denied the vote by law, as I stated before. So you could see this racial backlash from white supremacists against having the political system be inclusive for African Americans because they saw them as inferior. In their minds, they did not want to share power with any groups they considered to be less than them. The white supremacists did not want Black people to have power to the point where they threatened them to not exercise their political power. Now, let's look at a Supreme Court case, Giles versus Harris, which dealt with a struggle a Black person faced with voter registration. In a courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama in 1902, a Black person wanted to register to vote. For the past 20 years, he has voted. He works for the post office as the janitor. He could read and write, paid the $1.50 poll tax, and does not have a criminal record. He lives in the city and owns his house. However, the staff member said, quote, "No, you can't do that. Not allowed. Ain't you heard about the new Constitution? We ain't letting any of you people vote no more. Alabama is going to be run the way it should have been. You ain't of good character," unquote. In 1901, the all-white Alabama legislature drafted a new constitution specifically aimed at denying the vote to African Americans. Even though it never mentioned race, it set conditions for registration that almost every white man and almost no Black man could meet. being a war veteran or the son or grandson of one, called the Fighting Grandfather Clause, then required a literacy test, poll tax, and payment of property taxes for anyone of good character who didn't meet that standard, and voting registrars could decide who was of good character and who was not. Alabama Governor William Dorsey Giles said, quote, "Registrars will carry out the spirit of the Constitution, which looks to the registration of all white men not convicted of crimes and only a few Negroes," unquote. The Colored Men's Suffrage Association said, quote, "They did just what we thought. We move ahead. We'll get all the records and prove that Alabama wrote this Constitution to keep us from voting. We're citizens just like white folks. And the Constitution says we get to vote just like white folks," unquote. There was some skepticism that 5,000 black men suing the state of Alabama will work, especially when they need money for a lawyer. Someone named Jackson would bring the lawsuit himself. He said, quote, "No one else's name needs to be on it, so no one else will have any risk. If I win, we all get to vote. As for money, we'll all chip in, and then we'll put an ad in the newspaper for the rest. Black folks will support us. You'll see," unquote. But most African Americans in Alabama did not have enough money to help. To win the lawsuit, Giles would have to gather records from all over the state and then find a way to present them in federal court. It was a huge job. There was a lawyer named Wilford Smith who was said to be the only black lawyer who ever won a case before the Supreme Court. He wanted to handle this case for free. Wilford wanted to keep this a secret because they would lose all support from rich white people if they knew Wilford was funding a lawsuit to get black people to vote. They would communicate in code with fake names for them. On February 24th, 1903, Giles versus Harris reached the Supreme Court. Wilford Smith presented overwhelming evidence that discrimination against his client sprung directly from the 1901 Alabama Constitution. He said, quote, "If the suffrage provisions of the Constitution of Alabama bore equally upon the whites and blacks alike, no matter what the standard of property or education required might be, no cause of complaint would be urged here against them. But they sought to restrict the suffrage of the blacks without depriving a single white man of his right to vote," unquote. Among the 9 justices, Smith would need to persuade a new appointee, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He was a celebrated legal philosopher and former war hero, and he had arrived on the court just 2 months before. He was wounded 3 times, fighting for the Union during the Civil War. He became a distinguished lawyer and judge and was eventually nominated by Theodore Roosevelt to the Supreme Court. But Holmes had a dark side. In 1927, Holmes wrote a decision upholding the forced sterilization of Carrie Buck, a 19-year-old woman in Virginia who was, wrongfully as it turned out, thought to have an intellectual disability. This was in Buck v. Bell. He wrote, quote, "Instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kinds. 3 generations of imbecilities are enough," unquote. He was also anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, and a social Darwinist. In this case, Giles versus Harris, Holmes brought those views to his decision. He said, quote, "The court agrees that the Alabama Constitution is a fraud. It was written to exclude Mr. Giles and other Negroes. So Mr. Giles asked the Supreme Court to force Alabama to include him in the voting list. But if we add him to a fraudulent list, the Supreme Court becomes a partner to the fraud. Since we can't be a partner to a fraud, we can't make Alabama include him in the voting list," unquote. This meant that while the Supreme Court believed there was something wrong with the Alabama Constitution, the Supreme Court did not make Alabama change their constitution. In fact, it looked like they punished Giles by not letting him be on the voting list and effectively not letting him have voting rights instead of telling Alabama to fix their voting systems. It sounds backwards when you think about it. This is another instance of the judicial branch not uplifting the voting rights of black people by finding some way to turn a discrimination problem on a black person. After Giles versus Harris, black voting rights in the South were all but eliminated for more than half a century, and the negative effects of Jim Crow took its place. The predictions by radical Republicans just after the Civil War of slavery in all but name came true, and citizenship for Black Americans lost its meaning. Without the protections and enforcement to keep political participation inclusive for Black people, bad actors can exploit any loopholes they find to exclude Black people from civic life and continue to attempt to not have them belong in society. As I stated before, Jim Crow would remain for the next several decades that kept this system of exclusion and racial discrimination against African Americans. However, Jim Crow did start to dwindle and eventually end when the civil rights movement occurred in the 1960s. On March 7th, 1965, 600 men and women set out for Selma, Alabama on a 54-mile march to the state capitol in Montgomery. They were led by John Lewis, the 25-year-old son of an Alabama sharecropper, and Hosea Williams, who had a master's degree in chemistry and had been wounded in action in World War II while serving in General George S. Patton's Third Army. They were marching for the right of African Americans to vote when they crossed a bridge named for a former leader of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. They were attacked by state troopers and local police. The horrific images on television in prime time spurred outrage across America. The following week, President Lyndon Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress and demanded change. After President Johnson's speech, Congress passed, and then Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The act resulted in the registration of millions of African Americans who had been denied the right to vote, and it changed the nation. Black Americans were elected to Congress and even the presidency. John Lewis, elected from Georgia, became one of the longest-serving congressmen in American history. But despite all of this progress, the fight is not over. In fact, it may never be. There are those who would deprive Black Americans of their right to vote once more. And when people's voting rights are continuing to be limited, it takes away a crucial power to make change in our government. Only a nation committed to fairness and equality can prevent them from succeeding. That is the main takeaway from all of this when it comes to fulfilling the citizenship's sense of belonging and inclusivity. We saw how there was a resistance to change when it came to giving more civil rights to Black people, and that resistance is not going away anytime soon. This is where we as citizens come in. We know that inclusivity is a key component to making positive change together, but if we let bad actors try to make our country look and think the same forever, we will keep being static and not be prepared to address the challenges our country faces. We have to be open-minded and not let fear of change prohibit us from making necessary progress as a country. We have now finished going through the first part of this video set series. In the next video, we proceed into the second part by starting to talk about the rise of immigrants, especially Asian immigrants. From then on, we will look at how immigrants were historically treated in this country and their struggle for belonging. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.